Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Kuderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kuderna, and I'm happy to be back. I know we had a few week hiatus there, and I have exciting news to share that a lot of that was spent planning and revamping for what is now going to be season 2 of the podcast. And so I'll give you a bit of a teaser today. This is kind of our trailer for what the next year or so is going to look like. So I know we've covered a very diverse set of topics over the past year and a half, had some awesome guests on the show. We're going to keep doing that, but really the emphasis of this upcoming season is going to be the groundwork of my upcoming book, which will be a revision, a second edition of sorts to Millennial Millionaire. So for any of you listeners that aren't aware, I came out with Millennial Millionaire in 2016. It was subtitled A Guide to Become a Millionaire by 30. It was really a financial literacy course, kind of a crash course of sorts for millennials and what to look for in the realm of financial planning. We're certainly going to do that again in round 2, updated for the current era. But this edition is going to be much more an outlook, an economic outlook of the world moving forward for millennials. Okay, so we're going to look at things from a macroeconomic standpoint. What are some of the issues, the challenges for America, for the global scene as a whole? And then also microeconomic issues. What can you do day by day to put yourself in the best position possible to take advantage of, all the future ahead of us? So I'm really excited. We've got a lot to talk about here. But what I'm going to highlight are just some of what will probably eventually be chapters of the upcoming book, but also episodes of this show that I'll be speaking to, as well as some really cool guests that we'll have on as well.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Kuderna Podcast.
So why am I coming out with a second edition? Obviously, one of the only constants that we can guarantee in the world is change. Okay, the world just keeps spinning, things keep on changing, and it's really eye-opening as I started to do a little research for our outline here. Again, my first book, it came out in 2016. If we just look at what happened since 2016, not even 5 whole years later, all right, we had Donald Trump becoming president and then getting impeached twice. Quite one of the most historic presidencies, love him or hate him, that I think we've ever seen. We had Brexit, all right, Great Britain leaving the EU. We had NFL players kneeling for the anthem. We had the debut of Snapchat, which has taken the young generations by storm. Opioids have become the leading cause of death for people under the age of 50 in America. We've seen some of the most damaging hurricane seasons and global wildfires in recorded history. We had California legalizing the recreational use of weed and marijuana. That's now kind of spreading through the country. I'm just rattling off things here, guys. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, apologizing before Congress after Cambridge Analytica achieved access to 50 million Facebook users' info. We had the rise and fall, and then the rise again of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. We had the college scandal, Notre Dame Cathedral catching fire, 2-year investigation on Russia meddling in the election, student-led protests in Hong Kong, Jeffrey Epstein commits suicide after all of the Hollywood outbreak of scandals and sexual abuse. We had Tiger Woods winning the Masters, okay, his first major since 2008. And then more recently in 2020, as you all know, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic. We had riots throughout the country, kind of concluding the year or starting the new year, I should say, with riots leading literally into the Capitol building. We had the late Kobe Bryant pass away in a helicopter accident. The Boy Scouts of America declared bankruptcy. We have the oldest elected president in U.S. history and the first black female vice president in U.S. history, and a very contested mail-in election in 2020. So, the list goes on and on here. I don't want to bore you guys, but just to show you, why we need to kind of keep up with the times, because boy, are they moving fast. But when we take a look at things from an economic standpoint, Again, consider this a trailer for the upcoming season. What are some of the things that millennials or any young professionals need to think about for the future? We're all on that journey to achieve financial independence. Could be for retirement, whether we want to retire or we have to retire someday, so that we know we can fall back on something and not have to work ourselves to the grave or hit the panic button, and just achieve, a sense of security and happiness through our financial plan. So what are the elephants in the room that are something to be concerned of? Well, if we start with retirement, the backbone of retirement today is the Social Security system. Okay, largest source of retiree income. It's been around since the 1940s and hasn't gone through, honestly, that many changes as we've seen the world, our country, have just tremendous changes over those decades. And then, of course, defined benefit pensions that so many people used to rely on, perhaps working for the government, working for the big union, so that they could retire and say, hey, I'll keep getting paid every month and I'm going to be okay. So those are two of the biggest sources, but as we're going to talk about in depth in some of these episodes and the upcoming book, is what kind of shape are these systems in and why are they in that shape, which will be a nice segue to our whole conversation on population. All right, the population of the world has changed, and certainly here in America. So we'll talk a lot about that. Right now, we're having less babies than we ever have in history, yet we have more older folks than we've ever had in history, depending on the youthful production and tax paying to support all of these systems I mentioned. So we'll talk about some of these population dynamics that some would say are approaching, crisis mode. We'll talk about some of the immigration issues. Some could call that another crisis or problem, whereas we'll talk about it from an economic standpoint. It could be a saving grace, actually, for this country. We'll talk about computer chip problems. With the two major superpowers right now recognized by economists are the United States and China. Okay, in the tech age that we are living in, that's just kind of gaining momentum at warp speed, we're becoming extremely dependent on semiconductors and computer chips. Okay, so we'll talk about that shortage right now, where that almost in and of itself is a natural resource of sorts. And that'll segue right into actual natural resources, and whether it be gold and silver or actually oil, which has certainly been a huge player for the global economy for almost a century now, if not more, and how we're becoming somewhat independent, but at the same time still slightly dependent on that and the shift that that'll have on the global economy. We'll talk about Medicare and Medicaid. The healthcare sector as a whole here in America, which is certainly under the spotlight, with this recent pandemic that we're all living through. So that is, one of the biggest liabilities for our government is the Medicare and Medicaid system. So how do we keep that solvent and going, or how might that be addressed in the future and decades from now? So there's certainly a lot here to talk about, guys. We've had a lot of changes, like I mentioned. But we're going to address each one of these issues from an empirical standpoint. And that's really my assurance to all of you listeners out there, is I know so much can be anecdotal in the news that we get confused on, what's important or what's not, what's an emergency, what's kind of just being, perhaps overplayed. So what I'm going to try and do is just simply show statistics. And there are just an incredible amount of stats out there. It's in my little bit of research so far for the book, I've been blown away by how much our country actually tracks. Going down to age, gender, race, income disparity, you name it, any sort of factor that plays a role in America's economy is being measured quite carefully. So we'll take a look at that and we'll see what's progressed and what's kind of gone backwards over recent memory. We'll dive into education as well. Again, another perfect time, as that's something being spotlighted across the country today. We still have kids that have yet to attend a full day of school in over a year, which I don't think anybody could have ever foreseen. But we're living through it, and we're going to see how things are going to change in the next year, but again, for permanent sake. So we've got a lot going on here, guys. We'll clue in on financial advising, the rise of robo-advisors, do-it-yourself platforms, the Robin Hoods of the world. We'll go through the good, the bad, the ugly. And we'll talk about, all of the basics of financial planning down to the micro level again. How to create a sound budget and what's America doing right now for budgeting. We're actually at one of the greatest savings rates in U.S. history, okay, which is pretty cool because if we rewind the clock just a decade or so ago, leading up to the Great Recession, we had one of the worst savings rates in history. So we can see how that pendulum swings over time and in shorter cycles now. Also, obviously, helped a bit by this coronavirus pandemic. And we'll get into all of these different entitlement programs and the welfare state that exists in pockets of America and what's sustainable or what's not sustainable. Who is it helping? Who is it hurting? And how can we continue to fund all of this? So there's so much things here, guys, that I think will be really exciting, and we'll try and paint the narrative of this history in a framework that we can understand and will be a story of sorts and not just kind of a regurgitation of numbers and figures. We'll get into diversity and inclusion in America and what that means in a monetary sense. We're going to talk about delayed onset adulthood. All right, I addressed that thoroughly in the first edition of Millennial Millionaire, but we'll talk about it today because it's still there, and it's not necessarily that it's a problem, but in some respects it can be. It's just a big change that we have to either get ready for or kind of adapt to. And we'll talk, of course, about the millennial retirement, what that's going to look like, and the overall state of home ownership and even where we're getting our news today as we kind of say goodbye to cable television. Just to give you a little preview on some of these cool stats we have out here, one of the most watched television shows today in America, which I'm also a fan of, would be The Big Bang Theory, which peaked with 12.6 million viewers in 2019. To give you an idea, that's quite a far cry from in 1972 when MASH had its final season and had over 106 million viewers. So the world's changing, guys, and we got to keep up with it. So please, I'd ask that you continue to tune in to the Kuderna podcast. We're going to get right underway with some awesome topics next week, and we're going to have some guests really cluing us into, their opinions. So you're not just hearing my take on things. And then last but not least, what's an overarching theme when people hear the word economics is capitalism versus socialism. We'll see where exactly does America fall, where have we been historically, where are we headed, and what's the rest of the world look like? And again, what that's going to mean to us as we try and create our own little financial bubble as a household or business amidst the other 8 billion people that are around us. So thanks again for tuning into this preview, guys, to Season 2 of the Kuderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kuderna. It's great to be back with you. And again, this is going to be an awesome springboard to what hopefully will be within the next year, my third book, the second edition of Millennial Millionaire. But in the interim, before that comes out, definitely go out and relax, pick up a copy of Anorak. It actually has a lot of these themes buried within a great fantasy novel. So check it out. Let me know what you think. Any questions, suggestions, topics, etc., keep throwing them over to thekudernapodcast@gmail.com. I'll see you next week.
The Kuderna podcast is for informational purposes only. Individual situations may vary, and the information should be relied upon only when coordinated with individual professional advice. Guardian and its subsidiaries do not provide tax, legal, social security, student loan, mortgage, or real estate advice. Listeners should contact their own tax, accounting, or legal advisors or the Social Security Department in this matter. All investments and investment strategies contain risk and may lose value. Brian Kuderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, Pass, 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Securities, product services, and advisory services are offered through Pass, a registered broker-dealer and investment advisor. 973-244-4420. Financial representative, the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. Pass is an indirect, wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Kuderna Financial Team and International Planning Alliance, LLC, are not affiliates or subsidiaries of Pass or Guardian. Kuderna Financial Team is a division of International Planning Alliance, LLC, a general agency of Guardian. Pass is a member of FINRA, SIPC. California Insurance License Number OK04194. Content of the Kuderna podcast is copyright of Brian M. Kuderna, all rights reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of part or all of the content in any form is prohibited without prior permission from the Kuderna podcast. The views and opinions expressed herein may not be those of Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. Guardian does not verify and does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of the information or opinions presented herein. Any third-party materials referenced cannot be endorsed or verified by Guardian and are used as the opinion of the author. Guardian, its subsidiaries, or affiliates do not provide or issue or advise for mortgages. This material contains the current opinions of the author, but not necessarily those of Guardian or its subsidiaries, and such opinions are subject to change without notice.